Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on From Cooperation to Collaboration. My name is Lisa Janicke Hinchliffe. I'm at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I'm pleased to be here today with my colleague Laura Saunders at Simmons University. We want to speak with you today, next slide, about collaboration and how libraries can be thinking about this, and also how we can educate our future library colleagues in this if we're teaching in an LAS program. Why do we want to collaborate in libraries? Well, there's a number of benefits that we can gain by collaborating in libraries. We can leverage our resources to have greater impact. Of course, we can share expertise and bring in knowledge and skills that we don't have in our own organizations by partnering with organizations or institutions or individuals that have expertise that we don't have. We can also therefore market and reach to new audiences that might not be coming to our library programs, but might be in the audiences of our partners if we're partnering with another kind of organization. And of course, the whole goal of all of this is to increase our impact, whether it's by our information literacy programs, our story times, whatever it might be that we're doing in our libraries. So the reality is, as we see on the next slide, is that we collaborate all the time. We definitely have multiple partnerships, liaisons. I think libraries are, at the top of organizations that join organizations and consortia. But I think then we also have to say, okay, we collaborate all this time, but do we? And so one of the things that Laura and I have been doing is thinking about this from a research perspective. And we came upon and think this is a very useful organizational structure for us to think about this continuum from the Tamarack Institution, where they have these two concepts of turf and trust, and the ways these play out across a continuum of the different kinds of collaborations that we may be considering. So they include in their continuum of collaboration where you're competing. Now, I'm not sure that we would say that competition is actually on the continuum of collaboration, but let's say it's pre-collaboration. Of course, then we can see that they go through coexistence, communication, cooperating with each other, coordinating our activities, collaborating with each other, up to the level of full integration. Now, at the level of full integration, I'm not sure you're collaborating anymore either, because you're now sort of one organization. But I think it's helpful for us to really think across this full range. So if we're going to think about libraries engaging in this kind of collaborative activity, and maybe that sort of right-hand side, if you will, of the scale of moving towards cooperate, coordinate, and collaborate, I think one of the questions that's really come for us as we've looked at this, and we've looked at both successful and not successful collaborations, is what are the knowledge, skills, and expertise, next slide, that librarians need if they are going to pursue these kinds of collaborations in the most robust way. Laura is now going to tell us about some of the research that she's done looking at this question.
Thank you. Yes, so Lisa and I have been working together for a while, and one of the things that we did was to run a symposium where we brought together librarians, journalists, and other people that we were considering allied professionals to talk about ways to work across these fields against mis and disinformation. And what we found through our symposium and through our work is that there was a lot of motivation for people to work together, a lot of willingness to collaborate, but that there seemed to be enough barriers that a lot of projects were not getting off the ground. And so we decided it might be interesting to try and explore what were some of the barriers and enablers to collaboration in librarianship in order to see if we could develop a framework that might help people get past those barriers and get into projects that were more at a collaborative level. So we did this by running some focus groups where, again, we brought together librarians and other allied professionals from both the public and the academic library world, and people from journalism, student counseling, career services, and things like that, to talk about the ways in which they do work together and what their experiences were and what helped them to work together and what got in their way. And from all of that, we were able to develop this framework for collaboration that you can see on the screen. And so at the top of the framework, you see the three enablers, which are relationship building, communication, and tools. In the middle of the screen or of the framework, you see the barriers to collaboration, which include funding, staff, time, and competition. And if the enablers are in place and if there's enough motivation, what we found is people typically are able to kind of overcome those barriers. And once they do that, we get into the rest of the framework, which focuses on the actual process of collaboration. So diagnostics and planning, alignment, roles and responsibilities, assessment, and project management. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this framework now. As I mentioned, the barriers to collaboration are typically funding, staff, time, and competition. And funding was the thing that came up most often, probably not surprisingly. Libraries are perennially underfunded, and most of the organizations that we typically partner with are often in the same situation. People did talk about opportunities to find grants. And one of the things about partnering is that people were able to leverage each other's grant networks and things like that. But just finding the time to work on grant writing became another barrier. So time and then staff. Again, just like being under-resourced with funding, a lot of organizations were working with limited staff, and that made it difficult to dedicate the time and resources needed. Competition or ownership was something that did not come up very often with this group. We included it because it was something from the framework that we were working from, and also because in academia, some of the librarians did mention that they would occasionally run into barriers, typically working with faculty, where in some cases faculty were a little bit unwilling to yield turf in terms of giving up classroom time and space or sharing things that they considered intellectual property. So in some cases, there were some barriers to collaboration in terms of competition, but those seem to be relatively somewhat easier to overcome. The enablers are pretty straightforward. The first thing is relationship building. What people talked the most about was the time that they put into sort of cultivating their partnerships. And in some cases, they were identifying partners before they started a project. And in some cases, they identified a project first and then reached out to partners that seemed to make sense. But in either case, there was a lot of relationship building that had to be done at the organizational level and the individual level. People had to build trust, they had to identify common goals, and they had to know that they were going to be accountable to each other. There was a lot of discussion about the role of communication and how important it was to keep the lines of communication open, to know who needed to know what types of information and how to make sure that that information was getting shared efficiently and effectively. And some of that then came down to tools. So people talked about both homegrown tools that they developed in order to make sure that their projects were running smoothly, as well as existing tools, collaborative and project management tools like the Google Workspace, social media, Facebook, and things like that. So in terms of the process, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but we do have a paper that supports this. So a lot of the first step is planning, just kind of figuring out what the project is going to be, who's going to be involved, and some of this came down to kind of aligning with strategic plans and objectives and goals of the sort of initiating organization. But then there needed to be alignment across the two or more partnering organizations. So both organizations needed to understand what the benefit was to their organization and how the project aligned with their own missions, goals, and objectives. Once that alignment was in place, it was important to really define the roles and relationships across the various organizations. So figuring out who was responsible for different parts of the project, and identifying how people were going to work together, identifying some leadership, because in some cases, projects weren't going to move forward unless someone took some ownership of it in terms of kind of managing it. And also making sure that there was some sense of accountability, that by knowing what they were responsible for, people would then act on those responsibilities. So related to that was assessment. What we found is that few projects were really engaging in high level assessment, but they all recognized the need for assessment. And so some of that assessment had to do with an assessment of the actual collaboration itself. So again, making sure that people were accountable for their parts of the project and that they were sort of meeting the goals that had been set. And then some of it was about assessment of the project. So was the project achieving the outcomes that it had been planned to achieve? And so although they weren't always doing this kind of assessment, most of the people involved in the focus groups did say how important it was to identify specific outcomes and metrics to measure those outcomes so that they would know that the project was accomplishing what it was supposed to accomplish. And then finally, the last step is just good project management. So again, finding the tools to keep everything organized, to make sure that the communication is flowing as it should, to monitor budgets, and just all of the things that would go with managing any kind of project. So the next step that Lisa and I wanted to take was to think a little bit about if this is how collaboration works, if these are the steps we need to take to make it work, and yet if it's not always happening out in the field, is there a way that people might be able to be trained to be better at collaboration? So is there something that we could bring back to the classroom or that could be addressed through professional development? And there were a few skills and competencies that seemed to kind of rise up from this research. One was the need for people to understand how to do needs assessment. Because again, these projects really needed to be aligned with the mission, goals, and objectives of the institution, and they needed to speak to some sort of community need. So it's really important for people who want to collaborate to be able to engage in that needs assessment to know what is going to work in their community. There's certainly also a need to be able to engage in planning. And again, this is planning from the highest level of strategic planning down to the nitty-gritty of managing the project. I touched on assessment and evaluation and the fact that too often these projects are going without assessment, which may make it hard also to maintain them because there isn't necessarily that benchmarking happening. So it's important for those of us who want to engage in collaboration to understand how to set good outcomes and define metrics. I already talked a little bit about project management, but the other part of this was all of the soft skills that go into collaboration. So being able to build those relationships, to build trust across different individuals and organizations, developing cultural understanding. And I don't necessarily mean cultural in sort of an ethnic sense, but in an organizational sense as well. So people talked about how librarians have a particular culture in terms of how they tend to get work done, how we tend to work with each other, and journalists might have another culture. And some of this even has to do with things like the timeframes in which we expect work to get done, say in academia versus in journalism. So being able to have that cultural understanding so that we can work with each other, establishing trust at the organizational and individual level, maintaining communication, and then again, finding ways to be accountable to each other through things like assessment and evaluation, but also through some of the tools that I spoke of, like creating Gantt charts or frameworks for roles and responsibilities or memorandums of understanding so that it was very clear to people who was responsible for what. And we thought that there were probably lots of different kinds of curricular materials that could support this kind of training. Things like case studies where people would be given the sort of building blocks for a collaborative relationship, and they would kind of think through how that might work. Doing strength and asset inventories for a particular organization in order to identify what it could bring to a collaborative endeavor. Learning how to create Gantt charts or role and responsibility charts. So other examples would be encouraging people to learn how to do storytelling, designing assessment tools, identifying collaborators and goals, and creating memorandums of understanding. And so now I'm going to turn it back to Lisa to talk a little bit more about these materials.
Thanks, Laura. It's really great to be reminded of the findings from those interviews, those discussions with the people who are trying to implement the collaborations. I just thought I'd give a couple more examples here. This is an assignment that I've done in my academic librarianship class, where we looked at, in an academic library setting, all the different possible campus partners the library might be engaging with. And so, to create a visualization, then this is an abstracted one, a generic one, but to have students actually then look at a given institution and to do this kind of visualization mapping of where does the library have partnerships, where does it not have partnerships? So you would move these circles around, if you will, to represent that. Another kind of assignment we might see on the next page here, an example of a potential partner analysis where you're saying, okay, we have this idea of something we want to do, which community partner might help us? And kind of trying to do an analysis of why would this partnership, the purpose of it, what resources and services would that partner bring, what would you provide to this partnership, and what kind of goals would you be attempting to achieve? And this might help, especially where there's multiple potential partners, to choose which ones that you think are most likely to be a fruitful partnership for a particular project. And we can sort of see on the next next slide, an example of how a student might fill this out as doing an exercise, or a practicing librarian might fill it out in an on-the-job setting. So as Laura promised, on the next slide, we do have a couple of references for some additional information, both about the Tamarack Institute, as well as the publication that came out of the investigations that resulted in this framework for collaboration, which we're now building on to say, all right, how do we think about teaching for these skills, knowledge, and abilities so that LIS students who become LIS practitioners are well situated? And I think particularly when we think about information literacy, then to bring it back to the topic of this conference, there's partnership really underlies so much of our information literacy programs, whether it's in academic institutions with faculty, in public libraries or other settings with different partners. So for us to really get a much better and deeper understanding of what are the barriers and the enablers of collaboration is an important part of us thinking about how our information literacy programs to develop in order to best serve the learning needs of our communities. And with the final slide here, we'll have a thank you and look forward to our conversation together.